Hey everybody, welcome back to Emma's Pearls. Today we have with us Kimberly and Sharalyn Howcroft. Sharalyn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. As Angeline said, my name is Sharalyn Howcroft. I am the project archivist for the Joseph Smith Papers. And I have been working on 19th century Latter day Saint history for about 25 years now, and have thoroughly enjoyed it. So you can imagine, if I've done this for 25 years, of course, I started when I was 10 years old, so I'm like the Doogie Howser of archives, right? I'm totally kidding. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Alexander Hale Smith, and I was curious if Angeline and Kimberly, can you explain how you were related to Alexander before we start into this?
Yep, Alexander is my third great grandpa. So he is Joseph and Emma's son, and then he had Emma Bell, and then Emma Bell had Roger, Alan, and then my dad.
Okay, Alexander is my great grandfather through his son Arthur, and Arthur's son Joseph Frederick Smith is my father.
All right. Um, I I'm curious to know, like, when it comes to family stories and family lore, what types of things were passed down to you from your family in terms of Alexander? What type of a person was he? What, that kind of thing. His sense of his character and who he was.
Um, the thing I liked the most that was passed down to me was what kind of a jolly person he was. He had a good sense of humor. He was very jolly-hearted. And that's something that's definitely been passed down. He had a saying, if you want to have a good time, take it with you. And there's some fun stories in his journal. I particularly like the one where he was a sharpshooter. He could shoot very well, but he wasn't allowed to be in the shooting competitions in Nauvoo because nobody could beat him. And just the time when he went out to go hunting, it was sorry, just the time that he went hunting and was going to go out for just a few hours, but he was gone for several days. And how his wife reacts to that when he gets home. There's just these humorous stories, and he seemed to be this very adventurous and intelligent man who had a sense of nature and just these amazing stories of taking the wagon train out west with Latter-day Saints incognito and all the things that he saw. And I could tell through some of those things where he gained some of his perspectives about the Latter-day Saint people. And I'll just share one of them. As I was doing research for my own book, he was talking about the many things he saw going on around the camp, and that there were, there was adultery going on. There was a lot of stuff like that happening, and he couldn't fathom how a church leader will allow something like that to happen within a camp that way. And he talked to one of the men about it, and the man said, "It doesn't matter what happens out here because once we get into Salt Lake, we'll all get rebaptized." And I remember thinking, a lot of those people on that wagon train were immigrants, convert immigrants from Europe, most of whom were Church of England or Catholic. And it reminded me of what has been said a lot just from friends of mine I know who are Catholic that I grew up with, and that is whenever they'd go out and do things they shouldn't, they'd say, "That's okay, we're going to go to confession and then it'll be fine." And so I was like, this is what he was introduced to, and that's why he comes away with these perspectives. He kind of lays it all on Brigham Young that he's at fault for these people being this way. So his journal really offered a lot to me to be able to see where some of the perspectives and views of the saints out west came from. But anyway, sorry, I just got off on a tangent.
No,
So,
totally fine.
Angeline, take it away.
No, I think it's great. Angeline, what about you?
So in reading his journals. So I didn't learn a ton from my parents. I had to actually read journals. And my dad, of course, he had no idea who he was related to. He wasn't given information about his ancestors at all. He knew his great aunt, and that was about it. And so again, he had to learn through journals. But he was a very, very tender father, like listening to the interactions between Emma Bell, my great-great-grandma, and him, and even Joseph Smith III, was very, very tender and very sweet. I do know she was very jealous or upset about all of the missions he served because he was gone a lot, and she was so close to him that she was upset that he was gone so much. He taught her to plant gardens and how to do things. So when he would plant a seed, he would say, put 3 in each spot, 1 for us, 1 for the mice, and 1 for the birds. And so they would always get something up. And I know there was a bit of fear with the LDS people in Salt Lake. I think he carried a little of the same, like they're gonna kill us, or fear that was carried through the family. If they learned about the Joseph Smith family, or we kind of talked about that, I think a bit ago, about the fear that the LDS or the Joseph Smith Jr. family carries, and worried that we would be murdered or killed. And so, and then I wanted to kind of read this journal entry he had when he was going to California. He joined an LDS immigrant train. He didn't give them their name. He didn't want to tell them who he was. And so he said, let's see. I gave them our names, except that I only gave him my first and second names. So my name on his list was Alex Hale. My purpose in doing this was to avoid any undue curiosity among the immigrants. For if it was known there was a son of the martyred prophet in the train, there might be too many questions and confusion ensue, or a collision on religious matters which we desired to avoid while on the plains. About this time, a little incident occurred which pleased me and left a pleasant memory to relieve some of the strain which affected us. One day I was assigned the position of advanced guardian. I mounted our pony and rode out in advance of the train. And then he went up this high mountain, and then he continues, taking the beauty of the scene, there came upon me a feeling of awe and reverence for nobility and magnitude of the works of God. And while this feeling was upon me, I became conscious that sweet music seemed to draw near, and tune and words came out full and distinct in singing. It was human voices, but I am sure angelic singing could not have affected me more just then. It was the immigrants as they passed around the base of the mountain. Whether they saw me and had been informed who I was, I had no way of knowing, but the words of the hymn led me to think so. These were a band of good singers, and they were singing, "We thank thee, O God, for a prophet." I have heard the hymn sung by a good many choirs, including the famous Salt Lake City choir, since then, but never have I heard it equally as it was sung at the base of my mountain. And I just love that. And he's just sounds like he was such a great, sweet, and tender man.
Mm-hmm. That's great. There was some information on him that I gleaned from some our LDS history sources. He was spoken of as a person who he appeals to the heart at once. He himself quickly is moved to extremes of sorrow or merriment, so that sense of quick wit that you talked about, Kim. And he has the gift of enjoying the good and beautiful things of life to a remarkable extent. Many times he was, it's a sense, he was a gentle person. He made friends readily and easily, that sense of gaining the trust and good graces of people. He was just a very, genuine and kind of a magnetic personality. A lot of people who were familiar with his father, Joseph Smith, as well as and knew Alexander as an adult, said that his gestures, his mannerism, sometimes even his voice, were much like his father's. And so he had these blue eyes. He had a ruddy complexion. His daughter Vida, when she talked about him, has said, very rarely did he give criticisms, but when they were soft voiced, and when they were doled out, it was because they were deserved. So he wasn't particularly strict or stern, but his children knew when he was serious about correcting them. The daughters also talked about how chivalrous and courteous he was, and very gentlemanly to his daughters. And but as you said, Angeline, he was a missionary, and he went on many missions. And so there's frequently he is not around, with his children, just because he was so. Most of his life after he was converted to the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he served multiple missions for the RLDS Church after his baptism in 1862, and served in California, Utah, the Midwest, Tahiti, and Australia. And so he's very much on the go with his missionary work. But I kind of wanted to start a little bit in his childhood, because if you get the sense of, when Joseph was murdered in Carthage jail, Alexander was 6 years old. And so his perception of his father is, to some degree is kind of shadows of memories, right? Because he was so young. And that his sense of his father is essentially coming from his mother or those people around him who knew his father. But I find his birth in and of itself rather interesting. So he was born in June of 1838 in Far West Missouri. But at the time, prior to his birth, Joseph Smith, he'd been gone for a while. He'd gone with people to survey land for Latter-day Saint settlements in Daviess County, Missouri. And so Joseph had barely come back into Far West, and the next day Alexander was born. And so you probably are aware of how his name was selected, or why it was chosen. But he was named after Alexander Donovan, who served as legal counselor for the Latter-day Saints who were expelled from Jackson County, Missouri in 1833. But also he had his middle name reflecting the maiden name of his mother, Hale. But if you imagine as a small child, some of the things that he's experiencing is, as a small child, baby in arms, toddler in arms, he's crossing with his mother over the Mississippi River on foot. At that time, he is not even 1 year old when he is crossing with his siblings and mother. And one of my favorite letters that I hear of Alexander is actually Emma reporting to Joseph about how they've made it safely to Quincy, and but she's telling Joseph now. At this time, Joseph is in Liberty Jail, and she's talking about Alexander and how he's learning how to walk around the room, and he's holding on to furniture, and so he's just tottering around the room quite rapidly. Apparently, he's getting the hang of walking around the room by holding on to the furniture. But after Joseph gets out of the Clay County Jail, the family lives in Commerce. But most of Alexander's life, his childhood, he's spent living in the mansion house, the homestead, or the Smith farm outside of Nauvoo. But when he reflects on his sense of his childhood, or the influences that he had as a child, one of them that stands out is his perception of his father. And I find this quote very telling in terms of the perception of his father early on, and how that was tainted, which is so unfortunate. He says, the influences around me were of such a character that enabled me to feel that with no choice of my own, I had inherited what the world looked upon as a heritage of shame. For at that time my father was looked upon as an impostor, and was persecuted and driven from city to city, and whenever his name was mentioned, it was looked upon by the people as a synonym, not a synonym. Apparently I'm having a very difficult time talking today. It was looked upon by the people as a synonym of evil, of wrong. And so, you can kind of imagine how, being a child, having very fleeting memory of your biological father, and yet this is the kind of thing that's waving over you, that, and something that, clearly he has no active memory of, and kind of the challenge that creates for a child to encounter that. But he does, he talks about, in going to the Nauvoo Temple and wandering the Nauvoo Temple in his younger years. So this probably would have been after the Latter-day Saints who had gone west are out of Nauvoo. So we're probably looking at 1847, around that time frame, where he's talking about how he would go, he would take visitors up in the cupola in the Nauvoo Temple to see this expansive view of the area. And he has this instance where he's up there, and the man who normally would give people tours of the temple catches him out on the cupola. He's like, "What are you doing out here?" Because there's, we'd like to think there's safety measures, but you've got this young kid out there just surveying that broad view of the area. But he, of course, he leaves Nauvoo with his mother, Emma, and the children to go to Fulton at the time of the Battle of Nauvoo. They return. Emma is running the hotel, the mansion house, as she's running it as a hotel, and he, is of course in that environment. But for him, as a matter of course, in terms of his early years, he didn't necessarily have any sense of religious inclinations. Emma, for the most part, when she was asked about it, she says, "Well, I didn't really want to push any sort of religious leaning on my children because I've had, I personally had so much sorrow and sacrifice of my own related to my faith that I didn't want to impose that upon my children." And so the sense of religious inclinations, or starting to get tied up into the sense of reorganizing, of regrouping, some of these individuals who are part of the church in the Joseph Smith era, begins to happen in 1851 and 1852, where there's this sense of these people that are gathering, and they refer to themselves as the reorganization. And for the most part, this is a group, they by June of 1852, they are gathering in conferences. And there is this sense within that group that they want to band together as a group, but they also have a sense that the instruction for the administrative function and processes moving forward is held in the Doctrine and Covenants. They call it the Book of Covenants. And also that in moving forward as an entity, that one of the descendants of Joseph Smith would lead their group. And so there begins to be these overtures from these people, many of whom were people that knew Joseph Smith personally, but decided not to go west for various reasons. For some people it was financial, for some people it was familial. There was a broad spectrum of reasons that people weren't coming west, some of them theological. But they
I'm curious about how many would you say stayed? Like, how many neighbors did Emma have that she...
Well, so in Nauvoo proper, that's very difficult to say, because at the time of the when Nauvoo was in its heyday, you're looking at around 30,000 people. And then it goes from that, my understanding was, to probably, I think probably about 1,000, or maybe even fewer than that. And so, some of the people that stayed behind, there was William Marks, who was the Nauvoo stake president. Emma, he was a family friend, but also Emma had several dealings with him in terms of the Relief Society. So one of the things that is noticed is that a lot of the financial dispersals that are occurring, that are being given to the Relief Society, are coming through William Marks. And so there's this exchange there between the two of them, Emma as Relief Society president and kind of the keeper of the dispersal of those funds, but also he as stake president transmitting those to her. And Emma certainly wanted him to become a trustee and trust of the church, and possibly even prophet and president of the church. So there was certainly a level of trust there with him. There's also other folks who weren't necessarily living in Nauvoo but were in the vicinity. So you have Zenas Gurley, who is living in Iowa, who had known the Smith boys, Joseph Smith III, Alexander David Hiram in their young years, so he was part of the reorganization, and he was encouraging the boys to come join this. And so these people were also in outlying settlements, not just in Nauvoo, but in these outlying settlements that were members of the church, but wanted to be a part of this reorganization. So for the most part, when these overtures were made to Joseph Smith III in 1856 was, I believe, the first attempt where they were encouraging him to become part of this reorganization, and he was very reluctant. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is he didn't feel like, he wasn't sure if that was what he should do. And there was a lot of pressure that because he was Joseph's descendant, that he was Joseph's son, that he should be the one to do this. And he was reluctant to do that because he felt like if he was in fact to do that, if that was exactly what God wanted him to do, that God would reveal it to him much like God had revealed it to his father, that there was a work for him to do. And so he held back from that until around 1859. He's like, you know what, I'm actually feeling some stirrings within my soul to be a part of this group, to be part of these people. And so he and Emma attend the annual conference. At that point, it was 1859 annual conference of this group. And he really felt some stirrings. And so in the April 1860 conference, this reorganization met in Amboy, Illinois, and Joseph Smith III joined the reorganization. Of course, at that time, and he speaks to the congregation. There's about 300 people there, and he speaks about his reticence for assuming this position. But after going through that, he also explained his experience with what he referred to as the divine inspirator to urge him to accept this role, this office as president of this reorganization. And it was only a shortly while after that he was actually identified as president of the church, and then it was referred to as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But at the time that he accepted that, Emma joined the reorganization as well. David Hiram ended up getting baptized into the RLDS Church, but Alexander is staying away from it. He just doesn't feel right about joining. He's not in a space where he feels like he should. In the meantime, he gets in 1861 he gets married to Elizabeth Kendall, and then by 1862 he has a series of experiences. Of course, he saw his brother David Hiram get baptized, but he refuses to go down to the river, down to the water. He's actually seeing it afar off. Mm-hmm. And he starts having these stirrings within his heart. And there's several things that lead to this coming to the faith, coming to the reorganized church, and part of that was he had experienced the death of his brother Frederick Granger William Smith, and that the death of his brother just devastated him, wrecked him, and he had this experience of the Spirit speaking to him and basically saying, things will be fine, things will be well with your brother, and kind of urging him on. And so he gets baptized in 1862, and his wife Elizabeth gets baptized shortly thereafter. But
Hey, Sharalyn,
yeah,
really quick,
absolutely.
can I just ask you, just to kind of confirm, when Emma when she joined, was she actually, because I've been told two different things. I'd been told that her original baptism was just accepted and she was admitted as a member of the church. Is that?
Yes, that is correct. And so and that was one of the things that was determined. I believe that decision stemmed in part from that 1860 conference, is many of these people that were gathering, congregating, had already been baptized.
Right.
And so the sense was, well, we have all these people that have been baptized. Why don't we just receive their original baptisms? And so that's what they did. And so, yes, Emma was received by her original baptism. Now, David Hiram, of course, he did. This was his first baptism for him, and so he's actually getting baptized, and it's Joseph Smith III who is baptizing him. And so there's, yeah, you are correct that there is this sense of transition of, we will accept those original baptisms, and then the people who are coming in, who it will be it would in fact be their first baptism, those people are getting baptized.
And I'm also curious too, because from what I have learned through family is that Emma didn't actually go. She supported her sons, but didn't participate necessarily. But I'm clear on that, I guess.
So her participation in terms of being fully engaged, it seems as though that's happening later. So there's, there is a point where she creates the RLDS. She creates a hymnal for their RLDS, much like she did her, the first hymnal in the Restoration. And so, she is taking part in that. But you are right in the terms that, she's not pushing her boys to do things. She feels very much that this should be their own thing, that they're grown men. They need to decide their path and their trajectory of their lives, and their vision and purpose for their lives, that's something that they need to establish, and that she should not be influencing them one way or another with that. And before the time that Alexander decides to get baptized, apparently he got really, really sick, and Joseph Smith III is going to give him a blessing, and he says, do you have faith to be healed? And he says, yes, I do have faith to be healed. And he gives this a blessing. He had apparently an extremely high fever. The fever broke, but he was still a little bit weak. There was a point where Joseph Smith III asked him, he says, are you going to be baptized? And he says, no. There's a series of 3 days that this happens. No. And the third day, he's like, okay, yes, brother, I'm ready to be baptized. And so he is baptized in the Mississippi River. But in short order, Alexander starts moving up within the ranks of the RLDS church. So he gets baptized, and I believe in April of '62, and then he ends up being ordained a teacher in September of that year. And then the following year in April, he is ordained an elder at a church conference. And he has this part of what led to that was this vision that he had of Hiram and Joseph in a crowd of people. And in that dream, Joseph told Alex that it was his time to take his place. And he was motioning to this speaker's stand that was in this group of people. And it for him, he saw that as kind of his sign of that he needed to go ahead and work more deeply into the reorganization and to take his place. But there's some things that are going on in 1863 in the RLDS Church that are really important to note. This is the beginning of RLDS efforts to proselytize, particularly to the Latter-day Saints in Utah. And there was there was also the sense that their intent was to recover members of the original church who had cast their fortunes with the Utah people. And so there's the beginning of the calling of people to serve a mission to Utah. So part of what these missionaries are proposing or proclaiming on their missions is they are claiming that Joseph Smith III is the rightful successor to Joseph Smith. And also that there's this heavy refutation of the revelation on plural marriage, that Joseph Smith was practicing plural marriage. They're saying it simply never existed, and there are a couple of things about this that are rather interesting that I think are important to bring up. Is that in the church during Joseph Smith's life, there is this sense of the right of office belonging to the Smith family, or Smith members of the Smith family. So take, for instance, William Smith is the patriarch of the church for a time. Now, when he dies in the 1890s, Alexander becomes that church patriarch. But you have that kind of stream of thought even occurring in the LDS tradition, in that that office of church patriarch was last held by Eldred G. Smith. Now, he's not a Joseph Smith descendant. Correct me if I'm wrong. He's a Hiram Smith descendant. But there is that sense of lineal right to office. And so this idea of claiming Joseph Smith as a rightful successor isn't terribly far-fetched, because there is precedence within the faith, or at least in even in Joseph's era. You had Joseph Smith Sr. as patriarch, then you had Hiram Smith as patriarch, William as patriarch after Hiram's death. And so there is this sense of organizational power held within the Smith family. And so that is likely taking, that's still in the active memory of people who have experienced the church before Joseph's death, this sense of the Smith family and the role that they hold in the restoration.
Because, Sharalyn, correct me if I'm wrong, at some point, the Latter-day Saints out west were hanging their hopes highly on David.
Yes, that's correct. And there's even statements from Brigham Young. There's a sense that David would take his place among the saints in Utah. Part of that was because of some things that Joseph Smith had said prior to his death regarding this unborn child. He said it would be a son, and the sense that he would hold standing within the church. That there was that sense of this, this unborn child and this son to take his place in the Latter-day Saints. But this sense of proselytizing efforts, Alexander begins proselytizing in 1864 in Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. And you see many times as he's doing his missionary efforts, there's when he's taking breaks from proselytizing, he's reporting at annual conferences for the RLDS on his various missionary efforts. One of the things that really, I would say that probably puts a powder keg under the discussions of who has authority and the issue of succession and which church holds that authority begins to really take shape in 1864 when a challenge, I don't know how to phrase it any other way because it's pretty strongly worded. A challenge occurs from R.H. Atwood, C.G. McIntosh, and Daniel Harrington who are RLDS. They're directing it to Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12. And they're challenging them to defend polygamy, Brigham Young's role as Joseph Smith's successor. They want them to defend the law of tithing, the location, Salt Lake City as the location of Zion, and the gathering place for the saints. And it's a formalized document where they are challenging them. But it's not just this document, right? This document is disseminated, but it's also this challenge is given by RLDS missionaries in England to LDS missionaries in England to refute polygamy, to prove that Brigham Young is Joseph Smith's successor, and why is Zion in Salt Lake? Now there were prior to Joseph's death, there were many options that were thrown out on the table in terms of where should we go. One of them was the Rocky Mountains, but there was also an idea of going to Texas as another example. And so these challenges, even when these challenges are thrown down to defend these things, there is a sense that people are holding back. And I'm not entirely sure if there was potentially some instruction that was given from Brigham Young or members of the Quorum of the 12 for people to simply not engage in that banter. But by 1866, you have Alexander is going to serve in the California mission for the RLDS. There are and there's quite a group of people in California at that time. In 1851, Amison Lyman and Lyman White had been directed to form a LDS settlement in that area, and to form a settlement in San Bernardino, and they did so. But when the call came from Utah in 1857 for people to come back and help them in confronting Johnson's army, there were people who just refused to do so. And so you've got some people that are kind of straggled through California and that kind of thing, but a lot of these people are being scooped up by the reorganized church. And so Alexander William Anderson and James W. Gillen begin to travel westward with the intent of getting into California. So they do some preaching in Iowa, but they stop off in Salt Lake City in August of 1866. And this letter of Alexander is rather choice. And it's written to, I believe it's written to Joseph Smith III. He says, "I have seen nearly all the big bugs here." I think he's referring to the apostles in the LDS Church. "I've seen nearly all the big bugs here. They all strive to win my confidence, professing love for the family to a fabulous degree." And he closes the letter, he says, "The people here do not believe that either you," referring to Joseph Smith III, "or David are indeed in good earnest, not working yourself, but simply giving your leave and names to someone else." So he's saying they think that you're just being lazy and you're sending other people out here to do the hard work kind of thing. "They are taught from the stand by their masters that David will be a prince and ruler of this people." So he's even hearing this sense of David's going to have a great position and standing in the church. But within a couple of months of this experience, Alexander is specifically sustained as president of the Pacific Slope Mission in the RLDS Church, and that encompasses California, Utah, portions of Idaho, Oregon, and so it's really a broad area. So Alexander Smith is part of that presidency, along with William Anderson. But as they get into the Pacific Slope, specifically when they get into California, what they do notice is, and this is kind of a lament of Alexander, is that the lack of elders. So there are missionaries out there, but it's just the network of elders is just too few. He says there are good men who hold the priesthood, but branches require presidents who are competent men. So there's a sense that the people that are there, they really don't have the chops necessary to be serving in administrative functions like they need them to. And so there's kind of this concern of that. So there's a sense from William Anderson that there's few laborers, there's heavy burdens, and even Anderson is really desiring more good, faithful, and obedient people in this ministry. But as they continue to work in the mission, there is this sense that the elders are beginning to awaken to their sense of duty. There begins to be this earnestness in this mission field. And while they're out there, they're collecting subscriptions for the Saints Herald, which is the RLDS's church periodical, and also gathering money to help with the publication of the new translation of the Bible. But you do get a sense of, in all of this labor that is occurring, that Alexander really, the people there, this people that he's engaging with there in the mission field, are really becoming dear to him, that he's really worked with them. And as he leaves the mission in September of 1867, he gives this farewell to people, to what he refers to as the beloved saints. He says, I have met the saints in every phase of life. I have endeavored to teach the principles of love, charity, forbearance, hope, faith, and loyalty to God and his Son, Jesus Christ. I have endeavored to share your sorrows, bear your burdens, and lighten your trials. Your griefs have been mine as well as your joys. I have prayed for you, have been sustained by your prayers, as well as the bounteous provisions for my own personal comfort. I have met you in joy. I have met you in trouble and shared the same. I have wept at parting and rejoiced to meet you. In all these scenes I have seen the workings of God's Holy Spirit, and I thank him for all his mercies to his choice people. So he ends up returning back home, returns home. He's released from his mission in the April 1868 annual church conference. He's got some wonderful highlights. In 1869, his daughter Emma Bell is born, but also in a conference there, it seems Alexander and David Hiram are appointed to Utah and the Pacific Slopes. It seems like he's in the mission for a bit, and then he comes home for a bit, and then he comes back out to the mission. So there's this kind of this off again, on again, which makes sense because in the 1860s, the RLDS church, there is this sense that the missionaries are supposed to not only provide for their families, but provide for their own support in the mission field. So it's not a logistical possibility for these missionaries to stay out in the mission field for longer than probably a year tops, just because of those financial constraints. But in 69, Alexander and David Hiram again go out to Utah and the Pacific Slopes. And this is probably where you have this is where you start getting this real confrontation between the sons and, or at least Alexander and David Hiram with Brigham Young. Alexander and David arrive in Salt Lake City in July of 1869, and they're looking for a meeting house to preach in. Brigham Young has refused to allow them to use the tabernacle because the boys have been very upfront with what their message is. Their message is Brigham Young's not the successor. Joseph Smith didn't practice plural marriage, and so there's this meeting that these sons have with Brigham Young, and it's apparent that in that conversation, part of the reason that he is refusing them the tabernacle is because he knows what they are going to preach, but he also says Brigham Young talks about the toil, the labor, and the sacrifice that their father committed to build up the work. And he talked about the name of their father affiliated with that toil, labor, and sacrifice. And he said, and now for you to request a meeting house where you would tear down everything that your father did that took years to build is the height of impudence. And so these boys are, and they acknowledge the work that Brigham Young had done to build up their father's name. And they said, but what sort of a name is it? A name that we, his sons, are ashamed to meet in good society. And it shall be our life's work to remove from our father's name the stain you have heaped upon it. So they have this sense that any ill reputation that their father has is because of Brigham Young. And it's very interesting how they both Brigham Young and the sons are looking to preserve the name and legacy of Joseph Smith, but they're not agreeing on what that legacy is.
No, it's interesting because Alexander's son Arthur, my grandpa, writes in his journal when he's 6 years old, he's beaten up by several other children on the playground because they called him a Mormon. And he said, I don't recall knowing at that time what a Mormon was, but would later learn. And he said that that's the word he used, that he regretted, he didn't like being called a Mormon ever since for the stain of polygamy that Brigham Young had put upon the family. And so he referred to that as a stain as well. And, there was, whenever Dad and his people, his siblings and stuff would talk about it, there was a shame attached. You mentioned that earlier. And even when I was 16, just 4 years after I found out I was a descendant, I was in Georgia and I went to a youth program with some friends of mine, and I had told that Baptist minister that my ancestor started a church. He asked who it was, and I told him, and he started talking how horrible of a man he was. And I can only imagine, because that hurt for me to hear, how that would have been, for Joseph's own sons. Anyway. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and it's apparently in this conversation in 1869, it seems as though there was some sort of conversation that had happened in 1866 that really rankled Brigham Young and his children. And I wish I knew what this was. It said, so Alexander says, Brigham then took me to task about what I had said in the garden 3 years ago. So that would have been 1866. And denied that the 12 ever did anything to embarrass Mother in any way, but to the contrary, that they had done everything in their power to help her in her time of trouble. Alexander disagrees, and then it just goes downhill from there, and the house starts to burn down. There's, Brigham Young calls Emma a liar. Alexander at one point says that he wants to strike Brigham Young for insulting his mother. There are some accusations that Emma had allegedly tried to poison Joseph, that she had stolen Hiram Smith's portrait, and that she had stolen some rings from the other widows, so Hiram's widow and Don Carlos's widow, which is very interesting, those accusations, because we can't really substantiate them except for one of them. And part of this, I mean, some of the accusations that come out, not in this source or in this instance particularly, but the broader scope of, there was this sense that there were some monies that were given to Emma to take care of some of Joseph Smith's debts. I suspect that was probably happening at the time that she was administrator to his estate, so people would, that kind of thing would likely happen in terms of the debts. But there was the sense that she had pocketed some of that money. And so there was upset about that. We can't really substantiate that just because there's so few financial records that, when it comes to history and records and manuscripts, the thing that usually goes by the wayside are the financial records, unfortunately. But also there's, and the Hiram Smith portrait that is now in the possession of BYU, and that was donated to BYU by Hiram Smith descendants. But the one that we can say, yeah, Emma did have it, was the ring, the gold ring of Don Carlos's widow, because apparently after the boys have this run-in with Brigham Young, I'll skip ahead, but then we'll need to come back to this. Apparently, when they go to California, the boys meet with Ina Culbreth. So they go and see Agnes Culbreth, who is in San Francisco, and they give Ina Culbreth the gold ring that belonged to Don Carlos. So there is, there is this sense that, yeah, Emma had that one. Now the circumstances around that, whether or not it was stolen or not, I have no idea, but at the very least, she had that ring in her possession. But in terms of this altercation in 1869 between Brigham and Alexander and David Hiram, Emma warned the boys. She said, they're going to speak ill of me. Don't let it rankle you. She says, don't let anything they say offend or hurt you. They can't hurt me. And I would rather that they speak ill than good of me, which kind of tells you the sense of how broad-reaching the ill will was at that point. But there's one remark from Alexander that I'm like, oh, I wish we had this account. So that, this back and forth with Brigham was, rather severe, but Alex said that no remarks were as severe as those of George Q. Cannon. So I'm like, well, what on earth did George Q. Cannon say? And I haven't been able to track it down. I would love to find out, what did George Q. Cannon say that took the cake on vitriolic words that were spoken in that office? I don't know.
So how many times did the boys go to Salt Lake?
So there's the trip. There's this trip in 66. There's a trip in 69. Now, it seems like this is all in conjunction with their missionary efforts to the Pacific Slope. It's not like, hey, we're gonna go to Utah and rough up the Mormons. I mean, it was just a sense of, no, this is part of their mission boundaries, and part of that is to proselytize in Utah. And so, that's what they're doing. And then David Hiram is out in Utah in 1871, 72 as well. So they're out here a few times. But when the boys are in Utah, they are open about their mission, and they say, for the most part, people are kind to them. But when they go to see Joseph F., their cousin, Hiram Smith's son, they can't speak about religion with cousin Joseph F. But this trip spurs Joseph F. Smith to gather around 25 to 30 affidavits from Utah women who had been sealed to Joseph Smith. And it was to some degree a knee-jerk reaction from this spirited and agitative visit from the sons, and these affidavits are effectively being produced in response to the Smith sons preaching against plural marriage. But they are getting converts. Even though they're being refused places to preach, there's many local papers that refuse to publish notices that they will be preaching. There are even rejected uses of spaces for baptisms. And there is this sense that the Latter-day Saints are being told, avoid the Josephites, steer clear of them. But, they are able to use Independence Hall while they're in town, and Alexander kind of laments. He's like, well, we're preaching to Gentiles, the non-religious people, and the Episcopalians. So it's not the group of people that they would prefer to be proselytizing to. But at some point, they're leaving the valley by November of 1869. And they do note the kindness. Some of their other cousins, their cousin Samuel and their cousin John, are showing, the kindred affection that you would have among family. And it's so there is the sense of, there are people who are being kind. They have some cousins out here who are kind. There's a point in the 1850s, 1856 actually, where George A. Smith, so Joseph Smith's cousin, is coming out and visiting Emma, and he's also visiting the boys, and there is certainly a kindness there and a love there. And George A. is even trying to encourage the boys to come out west. But the boys arrive in California in December. That's when they give the ring to Ina, Don Carlos's gold ring to Ina. And then they are out laboring there in the field, and they return back in the spring of 1870 due to David Hiram's health is beginning to fail, but also Elizabeth was sick with lung fever, and Emma is coming and nursing her back to health. But by the 70s, you've got several things that are going on with Alexander. He's reporting on the California mission, what's going on there. And but also there's something that's really important that happens at this conference, and there is a committee that has been assigned to draft a memorial to Congress stating their faith, their views on government, their church policy, and polygamy. And the document itself is really interesting if you consider some of the things that are going on in regards to polygamy and Utah and the attempts to start to crack down on polygamy, but as well as the broader interactions of the U.S. government with the Latter-day Saints and these Latter-day Saint branches, or I should say reorganization and that kind of thing. And it's the memorial itself, it's composed, the composers of it are Joseph Smith III, Alexander Smith, W.W. Blair, Josiah Ells, and Mark Forscutt. And in that memorial, they're talking about sustaining the government and the law, and the idea of separating government and religious influence. Now, these things are happening in territorial Utah. There's kind of this strange intermingling of government and religious, and trying to sort that out. And so and they're also talking about the affirmation of rights to religious worship. They provide these articles of faith kind of as a creed, and many of them are, some of them are echoing the articles of faith to some degree. But in that sense of those articles of faith, that creed, they are rejecting polygamy outright and are insisting that the U.S. government identify and recognize the reorganized church as the Church of Latter-day Saints because it hadn't been stained by polygamy. Now, at this point in the United States, this is the beginning of laws surrounding polygamy. We don't have some of the harsher laws that come later that disenfranchise them from property or that kind of thing. But at this point, we've got the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862 that's criminalizing bigamy. It certainly doesn't have the teeth in it that some of the later legislation does. But the fact that the RLDS are setting up their claims, they're kind of setting themselves up to be identified by the U.S. government as the legitimate church because they don't practice polygamy, and polygamy is already starting to get into the crosshairs of the U.S. government. So it's the sense of, we sustain the government, we sustain the law. We are not that. We're on the side of the government, and kind of keeping themselves out of the fire that is starting to pile upon the Latter-day Saints in Utah. So, during the 1870s, after this, Alexander and his wife, presumably Emma as well, they're involved in the Olive Branch, which is the branch of the RLDS Church in Nauvoo. They're attending those meetings there. But Alexander is also serving as a presiding elder in the Spring Prairie and Nauvoo district, which meant he was basically preaching in Illinois and Iowa, but he was going to various branches every Sunday and just in the vicinity and proselytizing and preaching. But there are several things that again, he goes out to California in 73. I don't get a sense that he's going into to see the Latter-day Saints in Utah. He does return from that mission in 1876. But by 1876, the RLDS Church, they're starting to gather in various vicinities, in various towns, and one of the places that they're starting to gather is in Decatur, Iowa. And Alexander feels this compulsion, this urgency to be a part of this gathering in Decatur. And so he moves his family to Andover, which is Andover, Missouri, which is just kind of a hop, skip, and a jump from Decatur. And it's kind of a hurried rush of moving. And part of it had to do with when transportation was available, and they realized, we've got to go now. And so there's this teary farewell from Nauvoo, Emma seeing her grandchildren leave as they're parting ways with her in Nauvoo. But when they leave, they go to Andover. He begins to participate in Decatur, building up of Decatur. He is in charge of the northern Missouri and southern Iowa areas of the ministry of missionary efforts. He receives word in 79 that Emma is dying, and he gets to Nauvoo before she dies, and so he is there by his mother when she dies. And there's this sense, he has this sense of grief, this tragic loss of his mother, but he's also dealing with problems on the home front. When he arrives home after Emma has died, his family is sick. He lives on a farm in Andover, and so he's needing to plant his farm, and by the time he's there, I believe it's in June, and so he's kind of behind on planting his crops. And there's kind of this sense of things are starting to, the toll of trying to do the missionary work and trying to keep his family in proper meeting for their temporal needs and that kind of thing, it's really starting to take its toll. and there's a time where the family is moving from place to place, and that just kind of this, there's mounting financial hardships. As I mentioned, in the 1860s, missionaries were supposed to support themselves and their families. By the 1870s, there are bishops start to provide some financial assistance to the families of missionaries, but it sometimes doesn't always follow through. And to be fair, this same type of thing is occurring in the Latter-day Saint tradition, where you have these men that are going out on missions, and there is this expectation that there will be some financial assistance or some helping of the families, and sometimes it happened and sometimes it didn't. And so there were times, for Alexander, when he would return from his mission, where Elizabeth and the children would be in some serious straits regarding the meeting of their temporal needs. And so it was a sacrifice and a hardship for these RLDS missionaries to be going out on their missions and to be working in the ministry. Alexander's back in the mission field in 1884 and 1885, and then when he is returning home in 1886, he does pass through Salt Lake City, and he does preach publicly. And a part of this, and apparently when he preached publicly, Joseph F. Smith was in attendance. So this is his cousin, Hiram's son. Alexander, of course, is preaching against polygamy. And Joseph F. said, "Do you mind if I speak?" And he said, "Sure." And so Joseph F. gets up and bears his testimony of polygamy. And he states directly that his father, being Joseph F.'s father, so he's saying, my father and your father were polygamists, and they lied in their public testimonies disavowing it. So you've got this public banter back and forth between the cousins about their fathers and plural marriage. And Alex said he was ashamed of Joseph F. Smith to stand before this large congregation proclaiming his father a liar. So you've got this, this is a decades-long feud between cousins over the legacy of their fathers, over the legacy of uncles, and who they really were.
Now, Hiram never practiced polygamy, right?
Yes, he did.
He did. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So the let me see. I'm trying to wrap up because I'm looking at the time and I'm like, oh, we're running out of time. There is a point where Alexander becomes president of the Quorum of the 12 in Lamoni in 1890. This is the same year that, all this time Alexander has had he's owned the mansion house in Nauvoo. After he and Elizabeth got married, they owned the Nauvoo, the mansion house, and by 1890 the hotel wing of the house was looking rather dilapidated, and Alexander laments the fact that he has to tear down this wing. And, this is actually rather difficult for him. And he talks about, the various things that are happening with parts of this. The dining area for all the hotel guests is very dilapidated. The floor is starting to cave in. And he talks about the rooms. And these rooms are, some of his children were born in these hotel rooms. And so this isn't just a hotel to him. This is his family. This has family memories associated with it. And so he laments that he couldn't save the hotel wing of the home. And so, you see the mansion house today and you look, and it's fairly small, but that's because, well, the hotel wing no longer exists. And it was actually jutted out from the back side of it. It was kind of an L shape. But all of that was demolished to end the rest of the house shored up and kept. That was still in fairly good condition. By 1897, he is appointed counselor to the church president, and he's identified as the church, the presiding evangelist and patriarch. But he didn't really assume that role until after William Smith died. But in that process of being a counselor to the church president, he is taking care of a lot of Joseph Smith III's correspondence. He's addressing a lot of the things relating to church governance, and he served as a counselor to Joseph Smith III until 1902. But in 1901, he is instructed that he needs to visit the islands of the sea and Australia, and so he begins his mission to Tahiti. And he ends up taking his secretary, Leon Gold, with him, and he visits Tonga, Tuamotu, Anaa, Makemo, and Raroia. But at this point, he's at a Tahitian conference, and he ends up ordaining ordaining a native church member as bishop. And it's a really fascinating story because prior to his travel, he'd had this vision of, should I be ordaining these native peoples to priesthood and ordaining them to offices? And he had this vision where he sees this native man in traditional dress. So he's got the traditional dress on the bottom half, so kind of the skirt-like kind of thing, and wearing a white shirt. And it was this confirmation to him that yes, the priesthood should be extended to these native peoples. And so this is when he ordains a native church member called Metua Ore as bishop. And he also went to Auckland, New Zealand, and Sydney, Australia. He ordains a man by the name of Walter Hayworth as a 70. And then he meets Richard Ellis, who is a bishop of, he was the first RLDS member in the area. He was a former bishop of the LDS branch in Sydney. But while he's there in Australia, he visits his daughter Inez Smith Wright. Now, Inez had married Sidney Wright in 1891, and they had moved to New South Wales, Australia, to be on the Wright farm. Now, this area was a remote area, and so they had their driver. So he's with Leon Gold. Alexander is with his secretary, Leon Gold, and their driver drops them off in the bush of Australia. And Alexander is a little fearful because he's like, we've been dropped off in the bush, and the driver's like, you just need to go up the road, you'll find it, and something like the driver leaves them, and so they're out in the bush, and it's starting to get dark, and they're like, and so he has this fear. He's like, are the native bush people going to come upon us, and are we going to die? What's going to happen with us? That kind of thing. And so he tells Leon, they get to this point where there's a branch in the road. He tells Leon, he's just stay here. I'll just walk and I'll see if I can find the right farm. And so he goes down one of the forks in the road, and he sees this home off in the distance, and this dog starts barking, and apparently Ina was inside this home, and she's like, well, why is the dog acting up? And she goes out, and she gives the baby to Sydney, and she starts running. She says, it's my papa, it's my papa. And she hadn't seen him for 11 years. And so this was such a beautiful, sweet moment for them because Alexander is there for 2 weeks, and he's enjoying the company of his daughter and his sweet grandbabies. And it's just a beautiful moment for him to have this respite with his family and his lovely daughter. He also, after that 2 weeks, he also goes on to the Sandwich Islands, and he visits Samoa, and then he's going on to Hawaii. In Honolulu, he gives the first RLDS patriarchal blessings that are conferred upon the members there. As I said, he was the patriarch, and he has this lovely send-off from the Honolulu branch at the harbor. There in Honolulu, they have the steamer, and there's these small boats surrounding the steamer, and there's members on these steamer boats singing farewell songs as he's on his way back to San Francisco. So it's just a beautiful parting scene. You can get the sense of the love that these people have for Alexander and his ministry. There is some efforts in 1907 to create a memorial to Joseph and Hiram, and Alexander is taking part in that effort to try to gather money to deal with the gravesite, but there's problems with that. Some of the financial support did not materialize at that point, but it's very interesting, when it comes to his, his family. He'd been living in Lamoni for quite some time at that point, and he was back in Nauvoo in 1909. He was started to not feel well. He was feeling sick and in a lot of pain, and he was. He started declining in his health. His daughter Vida was called for, and she arrived before he died. He also had his grandson Claude, who was the son of Frederick A. Were there at the time of his passing, but his wife Elizabeth did not arrive soon enough, and he died before she got there.
Hey, Sharalyn?
Yeah.
Can I just say really quick that what my grandpa had said to Dad was, he had always said that whenever he died, he hoped to be in the dear old mansion house, and that he had planned to stop there.
Yeah.
And while he was there, had met with friends and had steamed cabbage, which was one of his favorite meals to have, and for some reason he wasn't able to digest it, and it created a blockage in his intestines, and that's for days he suffered with that.
Yes, and
Lizzie was on her way, and her daughter picked her up at the train station, and since she saw her daughter there, she thought he must be doing better. Well, he must be doing better because you're here, but he had passed away.
Yeah. I mean, it's really tragic. And he.
Do you know what age was he?
So he died in 1909, and he was born in 1838. So he would have been 71. Yeah, 71.
Oh.
Yeah.
Rather young.
But I just think it was so sad because, as Kim said, he those last 3 to 4 days before he died, he was in a great deal of pain. But I look back on his life, and so much of his life was devoted to missionary work, and the amount of sacrifice he did he undertook to make that happen. And I think of the sacrifice of Elizabeth, Lizzie. She and Alexander had 9 children. And, how do you take care of 9 children when your husband is, so thoroughly engaged in missionary work, and, some of the financial difficulties that they had, and difficulties taking care of their farm. There comes a point where they have to have the mortgage on the farm, and they're trying so desperately to keep their Andover farm, and they just can't do that. And they have a series of moves within a few short years, just because they're kind of hopping from place to place trying to find a resting spot. The one thing that I forgot to mention was that I wouldn't call it a tradition, but the precedence, how much the Smiths took care of people. I think of Elizabeth, Alexander's wife. Her mother was a widow in England who came to Nauvoo, and she had her 3 children, including Elizabeth. She ends up remarrying, and she dies in childbirth. And so here is Elizabeth and her siblings. The second husband didn't feel like he could take care of the children adequately, and so these children are farmed out to people, and Emma Smith takes in Elizabeth as a child. And so
his mother and father made him get rid of the kids. From the journal that I read from Emma, and then he, not without anything, they wanted him to leave them with nothing, but he gave Lizzie, a shawl when she was, I think she was 11, and then just left her in the streets of Nauvoo, and she threw her shawl back into the wagon as he was leaving. She didn't want that from him. And then she went, first to Sister Bradley, who was also a widow and couldn't take her in, so she went to Emma Smith Bideman, and Emma took her in.
Yeah. So you've got this, and like Emma and Joseph do this time and time again so frequently, where they take people in who simply have no other place to go. And I think of, they're one of the hallmarks that people reported about Alexander and Elizabeth, as well as they're older, is how they would open their doors to people. And I thought, this must be a Smith trait, because, Joseph and Emma did it, Alexander and Elizabeth. I mean, when people are coming for these RLDS conferences, like, they are opening their doors to people and just bringing people in and loving them. I think, oh golly, we need more people like this in the world. Just truly accommodating. I mean, there's one point where they're Eva Grace, that's their daughter, married Forrest Lamont Madison. She moves to San Bernardino, and she dies in 1892 after giving birth to her son Lamont. And Forrest, bless his heart, he's unable to care for this baby, and so Elizabeth she gets the baby and takes him to Lamoni, and this grandchild is being raised by Alexander and Elizabeth. And so there is this sense of taking care of family. Family takes care of family. I mean, it's so strong in that family line, and just that willingness to, respond in a time of need. It's truly remarkable. So
it extends to animals too. Every Smith I know has a lot of dogs or cats, and it's cute because I found a picture of Lizzie when she looks like she's in her 90s or so, and she's in a rocking chair, and she has this great big fuzzy cat sitting on her lap, and there's, it's just this sense of, okay, We've evidently always loved cats.
Yeah.
Yeah, my parents have always brought in a lot of stray animals of any kind, birds, got them better, healed them up, and then sent them on their, I mean, birds. The dogs ended up our pets, but yeah.
But I think of his life and just everything that he did, and if you were going to sum up the person that he was, if you had to choose a few words to describe him, I've thought many times over this. If I had to choose a handful of words to describe Alexander, it would be missionary, without question. That's so thoroughly ingrained in his being. To be engaged in missionary efforts for nearly 40 years of his life is truly remarkable. But also that joviality, but also resilient. I mean, he talks about some of his despair or frustrations with the lack of finances as he's out in the mission field and caring for his family, and even some of the frustrations that he's dealing with in the mission field. And my favorite line from him, he says, "I'll bear with it as much as I can, and then I'll start kicking like a mule." So he's just there's the practicality to life and the things that he's dealing with that I think is admirable.
That's so funny because that sounds something just like something my dad would say. I've heard Dad say similar things like that, so that's really funny.
Yeah. So he's also, I think of that big heart of his in terms of the just the way that he took care of his daughters. I mean, that's one thing that people would remark on is how gentlemanly he was with his daughters. And I think that speaks volumes about his love for his children. And that, even though he was gone so much on missions, that the daughters are remembering that deeply. It formed a deep impression on them. So.
For sure. Thank you so much
You are welcome.
doing this with us. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you next time. Oh,